everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emma Goldblatt, and I am Program Director at Religious Zionist. Today, we're joined by Rabbi Avidan Freedman. He is a rabbi and activist working to return the prophetic voice of ethics to its rightful place in religious Zionist discourse and in Israeli society as a whole. He received rabbinic ordination at YCT Rabbinical School in New York. He's an educator at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and is the co-founder and director of Yanshoof, an organization dedicated to ending Israel's arms sales to human rights violators and establishing moral red lines for Israel's arms sales industry. He and his wife Devorah have 5 children and live in Efrat. So with that, welcome, Rabbi Avidan. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with Uri Litzedek. I think this is my first opportunity, but Uri Litzedek is, it's like when there's a person who you've known from the time that they were a baby or from when they were born, they grow up and they do amazing things in the world. So I'm pretty sure I had the honor really of seeing Uri Litzedek from its infancy, from the first Rubashkin's campaign. I was a student at Chovevei Torah with Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz. I actually remember I think if Shmuley is listening or listens to this, he can correct me if this is a myth that I made up in my head. But as I remember it, my first meeting with Rav Shmuley was, I think it was probably Central Park. It was before the school year, before the academic year began. And somebody told me, this Shmuley guy, he's amazing. He's a superstar. And I was a big Zionist, I don't know if I would say activist at that point, but I was trying to very much bring the voice of Zionism to the other students at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. And I said, oh, I've got to try to recruit Rav Shmuley to be on our Israel committee and to be a part of it. So Rav Shmuley had his own plans, and he was out to change the world in his own way. But I want to say that I think Rav Shmuley's mission and Uri Litzedek's mission to bring back the value of Tikkun Olam to an Orthodox movement that marginalized it is so important all over the world. But I want to suggest that in Israel, doing that is critical. It's critical in the medical sense of the world, in the literal sense of the word of critical. Rabbi Sachs puts it like this. I want to bring something from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that I'm actually translating from Rabbi Sachs in Hebrew. I think he may have written this initially in Hebrew because this is in his introduction to a translation of his work into Hebrew. And he says the following. He says that the publication of Tehillah Fractured World in its second Hebrew edition brings me special joy because this book, which first appeared in the UK and the US, belongs first and foremost to the people of Israel and the state of Israel. The reason for this is simple. Judaism is not merely a religion. Its primary concern is not an individual's relationship with God in the private chambers of his soul. The main project of Judaism is something else, building a society on the pillars of righteousness and justice, kindness and mercy, human dignity and the sanctity of life. And there is only one place that this can happen. Now, I want to say what Rabbi Sachs is saying. I want to say it even a little bit more provocatively. Judaism can survive outside of Israel without being a voice of social justice. For most of history, Judaism outside of Israel wasn't able to be a powerful voice of social change in the world simply because we didn't have the opportunity to do that. Since modern times, we've gained more and more the opportunity and the privilege to be able to affect the societies that surround us and to bring the voice of Jewish tradition and the ideas of social change to the world around us. And it's very important. I don't belittle it at all. But if we don't do that in the diaspora, Judaism will be lacking. The world will be the worse for it, but we would still exist. We would still survive. But historically, especially when we look at history religiously, through the prism of our tradition, through the prism of Torah She'Ba'al Peh and Torah She'Bichtav, And this starts to touch on what I'm going to speak about and get to at the end, the idea of the secularization of religious Zionism. Historically, Israel as a political collective, as a sovereign Jewish power in Israel, never survived when it lost its moral grounding and its foundation. It can't survive. Judaism as a national entity, as a national project, can't survive without Tikkun Olam. It's not just another nice thing. It's something that is critical to our survival. And this is a touchy statement, especially in this day and age. And the reason that it's touchy is because there are people who make the claim, some people explicitly, some people make it implicitly, that the state of Israel has no right to exist if we don't behave, if the state of Israel doesn't behave at the highest moral standards. And this really upsets people because this doesn't seem to be a standard applied to any other nations. No one says that. I don't really know if it's true that no one says it, but people say that no one says that Russia or China or whatever can't exist because they're not being moral. They say they need to be more moral, they need to fix their ways, etc. It seems sometimes like a kind of a double standard where the claim is that Israel doesn't have a right to exist if we're not living up to a certain moral standard. But I want to be blunt because I think we're living in times of extreme emergency. So I'm not going to mince any words. I think that Jewish tradition teaches, and I think that Jewish history supports the thesis that God agrees to this idea. I think that's what Jewish tradition says, that God agrees that the state of Israel, that Israel as a collective, not as a people, but as a political collective, as a sovereign state, does not continue to exist. Its survival is not guaranteed. The survival of the Jewish people is guaranteed, and we see in history that that's true. But our survival as a sovereign people on our land is and has always been conditional. It's been conditional on our moral fiber, on our moral behavior. When viewed from a secular lens, and I'm going to use the word secular in a very particular way for the purposes of this talk, but if you take religion out of the picture, if you take theology out of the picture, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans. And when Jews speak of existential threats now, we speak of Iran, we speak of Hamas, we speak of Islamism in the world, maybe we speak of global delegitimization of Israel. These are the threats to Israel's existence from a not religious perspective. But from a religious perspective, the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin says the following. It says when Nebuzaradan, the Babylonian general, comes to and is slaughtering the people and is making his way to destroy the temple, he became haughty. And at that point, a divine voice emerged. This is Sanhedrin 96b. And it said to him, you killed a nation that was already dead. You burned a sanctuary that was already burned. You ground flour that was already ground. The Babylonians burned a burned building. From a religious perspective, many of us are familiar with all of the reasons given by the rabbis and in the Talmud. The first temple was destroyed for this, and the second temple was destroyed for this. There is a theological backdrop and a theological explanation for why these things are happening. It's not about the Babylonians. It's not about the Romans. And I want to say that this narrative, the idea, this radical idea, problematic idea, and we'll speak about how it's been problematic, that our continued existence as a sovereign people in our land depends on our moral behavior and not on our strength vis-a-vis our enemies. This is an idea that I want to claim runs all through the Torah, the written Torah, the prophets, the Talmud afterwards. And if I want to really push, actually, I can already find it mentioned in the very first verse in the Torah, at least in the first Rashi, on the first verse in the Torah. Famous first Rashi quotes a midrash And actually, it's fascinating because Rashi isn't quoting a midrash. He's actually weaving a number of midrashim together and adding some of his own words to it. But this is what Rashi brings. He says, Rabbi Isaac said, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with the verse, this month shall be unto you the first of the months, which is the first commandment given to Israel. What is the reason then that it commences with the account of creation? That's the question. And the answer that Rashi provides is because of the thought expressed in the text. He declared to his people the strength of his works in order that he might give them the heritage of the nations. That's a verse from Psalms. And then the explanation of that verse in this context is, for should the peoples of the world say to Israel, you are robbers, because you took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be he. In other words, we start with Genesis in order to give us this answer to the nations of the world, right? That God created the world and therefore he gave it to us. But here there is something that people don't get the nuance of it. And I want to pay attention to the nuance. And you see it in what I crossed out in the text here. It says, he created it and gave it to whom he pleased. The Hebrew is la asher yashar be'inav. But the correct translation, I would say, is not to whom he pleased, but God gave the land to he who was upright in his eyes. When he willed it, he gave it to them. And when he willed it, he took it from them and gave it to us. This idea that God gives the land to he who is upright in his eyes it's not capricious. God gives the land only to a people that is behaving in an upright way. And in fact, in one of the first promises to Abraham about the land, God says that we will not get the land for a number of generations because the Amorites who are settling in the land do not deserve to be exiled. And so we, the Jewish people, can't go there yet. And when we go there, it's always conditional. And this is an idea that continues. We know it. The famous words of the Shema, V'haya'im shamoa, if you listen, this is what will be the case. We see it in Deuteronomy, in the book of Devarim. If we don't listen to God's words, Moses repeats it again and again and again, we'll be exiled from the land. And then we see it happening in practice. When the Jewish people come into the land, the prophets are constantly saying to them, you will not continue to enjoy this land. Your kings will not continue to reign. You will be destroyed if what? Not if the Babylonians are too strong or the Egyptians are too strong or you don't have a good enough pact with this or that nation, but if you aren't behaving in the way that God expects you to behave. And this is a line that continues even to when the Jewish people, after their first exile, returned to the land. And they returned to the land, and the prophet Zechariah receives a prophecy. And in that prophecy, it says, this is the word of God to Zerubbabel, who's the political leader at that time, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, said the God of hosts. What will ensure your survival here, God is saying to Zerubbabel in these first moments of reestablishing Jewish sovereignty after the first exile, what is going to ensure your survival is not might, it is not power, it is not the koach, but it is the ruach, ki im beruchi, my spirit. And these words actually are represented in what is chosen to be the symbol of the state of Israel. The menorah, which is surrounded by the olive branches, is a symbol that most relates to these words in Zechariah, and it sets up what I want to discuss as a dichotomy, and that is the strength versus the spirit, the koach, the strength, and the ruach, the spirit. And the question is, what is primary? What is the true guarantor of our survival? For many, many generations, Judaism, traditional Judaism, prioritized ruach, prioritized the spirit, as I've been laying out now. This doesn't mean that koach, that political and physical strength, wasn't appreciated and it wasn't valued, or that it wasn't considered necessary. We didn't just live based on miracles. In the desert, we lived on miracles. But when the Jewish people came into the land, there was an army and there were political leaders, there were judges, and there were kings. So all of that was there, but it wasn't seen as the deciding factor. Whether we won or lost, whether we survived or were destroyed, it was ultimately dependent on the spirit, on the ruach. We were exiled on account of our sins, and the belief that accompanied Judaism for generation after generation after generation was that we would be redeemed based on our good deeds. And when we would repent from our sins properly and repair our deeds properly, then we would be redeemed in that merit. Now, of course, there are a number of challenges to this idea. As I mentioned before, this is an idea that is problematic. And I want to say that one of the greatest challenges to this idea, to this system of beliefs, essentially was Zionism. The Zionist movement came along and said, we are not going to wait until our good deeds redeem us. We are going to take our fate into our own hands. We are going to exercise power. And Zionism, the Zionist movement, succeeds. It succeeds in bringing the Jewish people home. And not only was it not in the merit of our religious good deeds that all along the Jewish people had thought would bring us home, but the Zionist movement actually, to a great extent, represented a rebellion against those ideas, against the idea that those deeds would bring us back. And really, in many ways, many streams of Zionism were a rebellion against Judaism itself, against traditional Judaism. And it worked. And so Zionism presented a major challenge to this idea. Zionism, it seems, really proved that the Ruach was wrong, that the spirit was wrong, that the strength is really what decides matters, that we are able, that we don't need to wait for our good deeds to bring us back. We are able to redeem ourselves based on our own power. There are many streams of Zionist thought, but just in order to demonstrate the idea of koach, of this self-empowerment, as it was called, auto-emancipation, in its most pristine form, I want to share the words of one of the great poets and writers and thinkers of early Zionism, Berdichevsky, Michal Yosef Berdichevsky. And he says the following: when the Jews return to the land of Canaan and settle there as a nation, they must hold on anew to a thread that had already been severed by the prophets, by their excessive morality. Again, here you hear this rebellion against the ruach of the prophets, against the spirit. He says we have to go back to something that existed before that. Political and spiritual renaissance of the Jews as a nation, but as a Hellenic nation. What led me to this perspective is my final conclusion regarding the renaissance of the Jewish people as a nation and the clear recognition that it can only be built on, I think we got a little bit cut off here, but he says it can only be built on idolatrous foundations. Idolatrous foundations. Berdichevsky says we have to, and this was a stream of Zionist thinking which drew much inspiration from Nietzsche, who argued that this over excessive morality of slaves was a departure from the morality of the master. And Berdichevsky and others argued that Jews must reject this over-moralizing, this spiritual idea of Judaism, and go back to the way that we were once masters, the way that we were once conquerors. This was an approach that prioritized power and it prioritized survival. Ultimately, as the Zionist movement developed, it was expressed militaristically by Jabotinsky and by the revisionist Zionists. This was Zionism's great expression of the idea of the victory of koach. But not only when you think of revisionist Zionist or militarist Zionist, even when you think about the more moderate political Zionists, the followers of Herzl, really the core concern was security. And the core purpose and value in Zionism was survival and it was safety. Rabbi Moshe Avigdor Amiel, he was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv in 1935. And he writes the following. The foundation of Zionism of hatred is that wars between peoples is something natural and necessary, and thus it will be forever. Power is what rules in the world, and justice is something that only good for nothings adorn themselves with. And here Rabbi Amiel is criticizing not only more militaristic Zionism, but secular Zionism, political Zionism, Herzl Zionism, which came as what he claimed was a Zionism of hatred. It was sourced in the idea that others hate us and we're not safe abroad, and we need to create this home, whether it's in Israel or it's in some other place. We need to create a safe haven. And therefore, even for those Zionists, really the core idea was power. Whoever has the power, he continues, justice is theirs. And if we want to exist in this world, it is enough that we be a power in this world in this simple sense. For this too is a great principle, that the powerful hates the weak. And that is why the nations of the world hate us. And so this is a Zionism of power. This is a Zionism of koach. And it was a Zionism that that won the day in many ways. So it's tempting to say, and I think it's also actually correct to say, that these ideas of power that we've developed, that Zionism brought back to Jewish history, they don't have to be instead of. Maybe some authors or some thinkers put them as instead, but they don't need to be. They don't need to be instead of the spiritual values of Judaism, but you could argue that Zionism simply returned the value of power to Jewish history. But that both are indispensable, but that we need both. We don't want to just be a kind of a spiritual church without a nation and without power, and to exist dispersed among the nations and to be at the mercy of other peoples, on the one hand. But on the other hand, we also don't want to be a soulless nation that is only concerned about its own survival. You could argue, okay, Zionism brought back the power idea that we had lost, but in the end, we want both. We want both the ruach, both the spirit and the koach and the strength. That's true. That's correct. But, and I think this is critical, just to say that we want both is very nice, but it's avoiding a critical and a fundamental question, which is, what is the relationship between these two ideas? Which one of them is the ends? Which one of them is the means? If you consider it, if we would take the analogy and to think about it on the level of an individual, right? So ideally, every person wants to have material success and also spiritual success, material prosperity and spiritual prosperity. You know, there are faith traditions in the world which say the only way to get to spiritual prosperity is to be an ascetic, is to vow off all physical pleasures. But in general, that's not considered, although there are voices like that within Jewish tradition, it's not considered to be the mainstream of Jewish thought. Generally, Judaism is considered, is thought of as a kind of a religion which embraces the physical, which says that there is a place for it. So there is a place for both of them. But again, on the individual level, what's the relationship? What's primary? When you get to an extreme cases, often this kind of question can come to a head. What happens when these two things conflict? What happens when a person is in a situation where their deepest values conflict with their need to survive? How do you choose? Are you going to choose to live, even if it means sacrificing your most deeply held values? Or are you going to sacrifice for the values, even at the cost of your life? So that's the kind of question we have at the extreme. But these kind of questions also have ripple effects in much less extreme situations. I mean, if my material prosperity is a value to me, and if that becomes the ultimate end, then even if I want to have values and if I want to be moral, if being prosperous is going to be the ultimate end, I'm going to find that I'm going to cut some moral corners along the way. I'm going to fudge things in order to get to that end of material prosperity. Right? So we can see that the two values, they can conflict with each other at the extremes, and also not just at the extremes. No, are there values that I'm willing to give my life for? And are there values that I'm willing to sacrifice for? Or do I say, well, no, I need to make a living, I need to provide for my family, and therefore I can justify X, Y, and Z. Or I need to do this, I need to accomplish that. And you can think of all kinds of moral dilemmas and moral situations where these things actually come into conflict. And so this becomes a defining life question. A defining life question is, what is my ultimate ends in life? Is it survival? Is it living? Is it my physical, material life? Or is it some kind of a spiritual value that my life is for? What is the ends and what are the means? And just as it's a life-defining question for an individual, this is also a life-defining question for a nation. What, at the end of the day, is more primary? Is it going to be our strength or is it our spirit? When there is a conflict between these things, will we say that we need to sacrifice our values in order to ensure our survival? Or are there times where we will say we're actually willing to endanger our security, our safety, even our very survival in order to continue to serve our deepest, most treasured values? Just to give you one example, I am an activist. My day job is activism around the issue of arms sales, Israeli arms sales to dictatorships. It's very hard to make a good argument in favor of providing guns to people who commit mass murder. It's very hard to make a moral argument for that. It seems like a bad thing. It's a bad thing to murder innocents. It's a bad thing to support those who do. So how is it that Israel and other countries, but I live in Israel, and so that's where my concern is. And it's, as I said, the place that I want to see aspiring to a higher moral value. How does Israel justify this? How do people justify this? Well, they say, ideally, we wouldn't want to do that, but we need to survive, or we need to make money, or we need to create diplomatic relationships, or we need it for our security. And so in this situation, even if it's not actually a situation where Israel's life is on the line, and if we don't sell these arms, it means Israel will cease to exist. It's not that extreme. It's much less than that. But still, people are willing to cut corners. Still, people are willing to say the ends of survival and prosperity justify the means. And so this is the fundamental question of the strength versus the spirit. Because yes, even though generally we'd like to have them both, if we want to know who we are, if we want to define for ourselves who we are, we have to decide what is the ultimate ends and what is only a means to that ends. And when they conflict, how will we choose? I want to take us back for a moment about 100 years to hear these two perspectives playing out in the Zionist movement. We are in the 1930s, around 1936 to 39, the Great Arab Revolt, which brings about, and whose purpose was to bring about a change in policy amongst the British. The Arabs started terror attacks against Jewish, then Palestinian, we're pre the state of Israel here, Jewish Palestinians, so that the British would feel like this is too much of a headache and they will stop allowing the influx of Jews to Palestine. And so the Arabs are committing terror attacks. And the question is, how do we respond? And there is a great debate amongst the Jewish settlers in pre-state Palestine. One voice is the voice of the Religious Zionists, of Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who was one of their great poets. And he writes in this poem called One Truth Not Two, your rabbis taught, he says, your rabbis taught, there is one truth for the nations, blood for blood, but it is not a truth for Jews. Again, we hear what we saw in Berdichevsky, the criticism of prophetic values, of rabbinic values. Here are the rabbis who say that for the nations, they say blood for blood, but that's not for us. We're not supposed to behave that way. And I say, there is one truth and not two, as there is one sun, and as there are not two Jerusalems. There was a traditional idea of a Jerusalem below and a Jerusalem on high. He says, no, there's one Jerusalem. There is only earthly Jerusalem. It was written in the law of conquest of Moses and Joshua until the last of my injured kings and lions, a truth that years of exile and traitors consumed. What Greenberg here is saying is if the nations act based on power, based on blood for blood, that is what we need to do as well. We're not meant to be any different. We can't be any different. And the only reason we were different was because of the exile, because of these rabbis, because of these prophets. But we need to re-embrace power, to re-embrace koach. And therefore they said what we need to do in order to respond to these attacks is we need to take revenge, and we need to be vicious, and we need to show our enemies that they can't mess with us. And that was the kind of rhetoric around the response that Greenberg and others were advocating for. Now I want you to hear the other side from Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, who was then the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. And he says the following. This is a text from a compilation called Against Terror, which was a compilation of many thinkers, including many rabbis, who were writing against these acts of, when they say against terror, they're speaking about Jewish terror. They're speaking against acts of revenge against Arabs because of Arab terror against Jews. And Rabbi Uziel says the following. He says this honorable quality of Judaism, the idea that he's referring to is the idea that we are just as afraid as the Midrash says about Jacob, lest we kill, as we are afraid lest we be killed. That's what Jacob expresses before he encounters Esav. He's afraid that he's going to kill, and he's afraid that he's going to be killed equally. And this honorable quality was revealed in all its glory in our settling of the land during the last years of upheavals that still continue in all their ugliness. We suffered much anger and terrible pains. Many precious pure souls were murdered with the shovels of bloodthirsty, cruel murderers who had no pity on the elderly or the young. They slaughtered mothers with their children and killed Jewish sisters that had faithfully served in treating their injured. They uprooted plantations, ignited produce, and burnt many buildings. Now, if we now in 2025 hear for ourselves echoes of our own experience from October 7th, I think that's correct. Perhaps it wasn't as bad, but from 1936 to 1939, Jewish settlers in Palestine were suffering terrible, terrible, terrible attacks. And yet, says Rabbi Uziel, all this we suffered with self-restraint of incredible strength. The fear of terror in all its might never scared us. We did not hide in our houses. We did not stop our work, despite the danger of ambush and death, which surrounded us. And when we needed to, our sons fought with valor and showed everyone our ability to meet the enemy at the gate. He says, we're not afraid of terror. We continue fighting. We continue defending ourselves. But above all, we maintained our unique character not to spill the blood of the innocent. To commit acts of revenge, of Jewish terror, Rabbi Uziel says, that's not showing that you're not afraid of anyone. No, that when we refrain from revenge, we are expressing our highest Jewish values. Even our enemies in spirit walked through our streets and settlements in tranquility, and no one attacked them in deed or even in word. Unfortunately, I have to say with great pain, in the past weeks, more and more all of the time, just this week, there was a violent incident in a cinema in Jerusalem. There have been attacks against Arab bus drivers all over the country. In the 1930s, Rabbi Uziel is proud of the fact that any Arab can walk through a Jewish settlement, a Jewish area, and feel complete safety that they will not be attacked in deed or even in word. With pride, we can say, our hands were not desecrated by the blood of the innocent. Rabbi Uziel says this is our strength as Jews. This ruach, these values, the value of human life, abiding by that, not falling prey, not falling to the trap of power, not deciding that we need to be just as vengeful as they are. That ruach is our true source of power. That is what allows us to exist here. If I fast forward as our time comes to a close, I fast forward now almost 100 years. I fast forward to the present day. If that was the voice of Rabbi Uziel, the Sephardic chief rabbi, and by the way, also Rav Herzog, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi, who also wrote vehemently against any Jewish terror and against any instances of Jewish revenge, and also spoke about how the value of Jewish human life is what maintains us here. It's what ensures our survival. When we fast forward, I think in many ways, this question for us today comes to a real head on the hostage issue. And if you listen to what the rabbis are, this rabbinic letter, which is signed by a large number of very, very well-accepted religious Zionist rabbis, and just to take a few excerpts from it, the partial deal currently being negotiated, this is about right now, is a dangerous one. It undermines, first and foremost, the main goal of war, which is victory. Also harms the people of Israel in unity. The deal undermines Israel's security. Hamas terrorists will exploit the pause to rebuild their strength and morale, return to attacking our soldiers. They will view it as an Israeli surrender. Halting the war and withdrawing from the area will, God forbid, cause many casualties among our soldiers. It is our duty to defeat the enemy completely, to destroy its communities, to expel all of its leaders from our land entirely. When Hamas is preoccupied with its survival, it will surrender. Only then can life in our land return to a healthy and whole path. Now, I don't even want to take a side. I obviously have a side and a position, but I don't want to take a side on what's the right answer to the hostage dilemma. I just want to emphasize that here we have the rabbinic leaders, not the rabbinic leaders, but rabbinic leaders of the religious Zionist movement, who, if you listen, what are they talking about? They're talking about strength. They're talking about power. At the end of the day, they're talking about koach. They're talking about security. That is the ultimate value. That is the ultimate ends. And this is a transformation from Rabbi Uziel and from Rabbi Herzog to these rabbis nowadays. This is a transformation in religious Zionism to becoming more and more focused on the value actually of koach. That's been a long time in the making. And this is what I call the secularization of religious Zionism. This is religious Zionism that has bought into the koach, the idea of that secular idea of we must ensure our power is the ultimate value. And it's something that's a long time in the making. Some scholars would point back to Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook after the 6-Day War, who was really one of the champions of this idea that the security of the state becomes the primary religious value. And this idea of koach essentially in that way gets a religious imprimatur, but it's kind of it comes with a guarantee of God's support. We will do whatever we need to do in order to ensure our survival, and then we will say that God is always going to be with us. And so instead of the ruach being a check on power, what we see happening in religious Zionism to a great extent is that religion becomes a stamp of approval to anything that power is going to try to accomplish. And what's fascinating, if we think of that transformation from a religious thinking about ruach to religious Zionism really being focused on koach, on security as the prime value, but giving it a religious adornment, a religious stamp of approval, there's also a mirror image to that, and I just want to finish with that as a thought, and then allow for any questions, because it's fascinating to think that the mirror image to that is that in many ways the movement on behalf of the hostages, what is it coming to say? It's coming to say, here there's a sign that says that the hostages need to be at the head of at the pinnacle of our values. There's another sign that says there is no independence without the hostages. There's another sign that says there is no victory without the hostages. And what I want to suggest is what these slogans aren't talking even about these particular people. They're talking about an ethos. The protest movement is saying that if we abandon our ethos of solidarity and of the value of human life, if we abandon that, Israel will not be able to survive. It won't have the strength to survive. And so here we have what's really the liberal Zionist camp, which has turned around and said, yes, we are not naive. We understand that a hostage deal may strengthen Hamas. We understand that releasing terrorists will endanger us and our own families. And yet we say that what is the real key? What is truly critical to our survival, even more than our strength vis-a-vis our enemies? It's our moral fiber. It is our moral foundation. And our moral foundation as a Jewish state is about the value of human life, the infinite value of every single human life. And it is about our connection to one another as a family and as human beings. And so you see this this real flip that has occurred, which I think is something that is worth thinking about. And I think that it is really a critical lesson to consider coming out of this whole period post October 7th. I would say October 7th, on October 7th, we received this huge surprise where an enemy, which wasn't the enemy that we were really concerned about, we were sure that our strength, as far as strength, we were much, much stronger than Hamas. We were much more worried about Hezbollah. We were much more worried about Iran. But all of a sudden, it's actually that point where we thought we were most strong that we end up being most weak. And out of that comes this dilemma of the hostages, where a huge majority of the citizens of the state of Israel are saying what really makes us who we are, what is really critical to our survival, is our set of moral values that we are most deeply committed to. It is lo b'chayil v'lo b'choach ki im beruchi. It is the ruach. It is this spirit that is going to give us the strength to meet our enemies. That is going to give us our strength to continue and to rebuild. And so I will just end really with a prayer that the government of Israel should act in accordance with the will of the majority of the people to end the war, to end needless suffering, not only of the hostages, but excessive and needless suffering of the Gazan population, of the men, women, and children in Gaza who are suffering and who are starving, and to end the needless deaths and needless suffering of soldiers as well, to stop the war, to bring all of the hostages home. May it happen by the end of the night.
Thank you so much for that inspiring class, and for your time. I wanted to give one more chance for any of our participants or anyone on the Facebook Live to ask a question. So anyone is welcome to comment in the chat or on Facebook if they have a question.
I just wanted to say thank you. I only caught the end, but I will most definitely be catching the whole thing again on recording. So I appreciate you.
Thank you, Isaac.
With that, I just want to thank you again for your time, for teaching this class to our community. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And please check out some of our upcoming classes that we have, our soonest being next week, July 30th, with Rabbi Melissa, and she is going to be talking about a Jewish case for social justice. So please sign up for that. We will put the link wherever this is posted, and also a way to get in touch with Rabbi Avidan. And thank you again to everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.